The sun dipped below the rugged horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty plains of Colorado Territory, as Garrett Holloway stood at the edge of his property watching a lone figure approach on horseback. His weathered face, tanned from years under the western sun, betrayed no emotion, but his heart hammered against his ribs with a hope he hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. The year was 1876, and Sweetwater Creek was still little more than a collection of wooden structures clinging to existence in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Garrett's ranch, the Double H, sat on a generous plot of land just outside town, a modest success carved from wilderness through sheer determination and countless calloused hands. Pa. The small voice came from behind him, and Garrett turned to see his 6-year-old son Tommy standing in the doorway of their cabin, his brown eyes wide with curiosity as he peered past his father toward the approaching rider. "Go on back inside, son," Garrett said gently, though his gaze kept drifting back to the horizon. "Supper's getting cold." "Is it her, Pa?" Tommy asked, ignoring his father's instruction, his small boots scraping against the wooden porch as he stepped forward. "Is Miss Abigail coming back?" Garrett's throat tightened. He tried not to nurture false hope in his boy, but children had a way of clinging to possibilities that adults had learned to abandon. "I don't know, Tommy. Could be anybody." But as the rider drew closer, the last rays of sunlight caught the glint of golden hair beneath a modest bonnet, and Garrett felt his breath catch. The slender figure sat straight in the saddle with a confidence that only one woman he'd ever known possessed. Abigail Zimmerman had ridden out of their lives 18 months ago, carrying nothing but a small satchel and promises she'd never intended to keep. At least, that's what Garrett had convinced himself during the long, lonely nights that followed. Tommy bounced on his toes, excitement radiating from his small frame. "It is her. I told you she'd come back." Garrett placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, as much to ground himself as to calm the boy. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But there was no denying it now. The figure resolved into the unmistakable form of Abigail, her familiar blue riding dress catching the breeze as she urged her chestnut mare forward. Garrett's heart performed a complicated dance of joy, anger, and uncertainty emotions he thought he'd buried months ago. When she was close enough that he could see her face, Garrett noted the changes time had wrought. She looked older, more refined somehow, but her eyes still held that spark of determination he'd admired from the first day she'd arrived in Sweetwater Creek. Miss Abigail. Tommy couldn't contain himself any longer and raced down the porch steps, across the yard, heedless of his father's call to wait. Abigail reined in her horse and dismounted with fluid grace, dropping to one knee just in time to catch Tommy as he launched himself into her arms. Her laughter drifted across the yard, a sound Garrett had replayed in his memory so often that hearing it now felt like a dream. "Look at you," she exclaimed, holding Tommy at arm's length. "You've grown so tall, you must be eating your vegetables like I told you." "Every last one," Tommy confirmed proudly. "Even the carrots, and I hate carrots." "That's my brave boy," she said, and the casual claim of connection made Garrett's jaw tighten. He approached slowly, deliberately, each step heavy with the weight of questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Abigail stood as he neared, her smile faltering slightly at the unreadable expression on his face. "Garrett," she said simply, his name on her lips a complex thing. "Abigail." He nodded stiffly. "This is unexpected." Tommy looked between them, his young face clouding with confusion at the tension. "Pa's been sad since you left," he announced with a child's brutal honesty. "But he's going to be happy now because you're back. She makes you smile like Mama used to, that's what I told him." The words hung in the air between them. Garrett felt heat rise in his face, but whether from embarrassment or anger he couldn't tell. Abigail's eyes softened as she looked at Tommy, then up at Garrett. "I've come a long way," she said quietly. "Perhaps we could talk inside." Against his better judgment, Garrett nodded and gestured toward the cabin. "We were just sitting down to supper. There's enough for one more." Tommy grabbed Abigail's hand and practically pulled her toward the house, chattering about everything she had missed. Garrett followed more slowly, watching as the woman who had broken his heart stepped back into his home as if she'd never left. The cabin was modest but comfortable. with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the air with rich, savory scents. The table was set for two, and Garrett silently retrieved another plate and spoon from the cupboard. "It smells wonderful," Abigail said, removing her bonnet and gloves. Her golden hair was pinned up in a neat bun, though a few tendrils had escaped during her ride, framing her face in a way that made Garrett's heart ache. "Pa learned to cook real good," Tommy said proudly as he climbed into his chair. "He says a man shouldn't rely on others for his basic needs." Abigail's gaze flickered to Garrett, a hint of sadness crossing her features. "That's very wise," she murmured. As they settled at the table, the weight of unasked questions made the small space feel crowded. Garrett served the stew, focusing on the simple task to avoid meeting Abigail's eyes. "Would you like to say grace, Tommy?" he asked, and his son nodded eagerly. They bowed their heads as Tommy recited the simple prayer he'd been taught. "And thank you for bringing Miss Abigail back to us," he added at the end, causing Garrett's head to jerk up. Abigail smiled gently at Tommy before taking a small bite of stew. "This is delicious, Garrett. You've become quite the cook." "Necessity," he replied shortly, then immediately regretted his tone when he saw Tommy's worried glance. Making an effort to soften his voice, he added, "It's nothing fancy, but it keeps us going." They ate in strained silence for a few minutes, broken only by Tommy's occasional observations and questions directed at Abigail. She answered each one patiently, telling him about the big cities she'd visited, carefully editing her stories for a child's ears. "Why'd you go away?" Tommy finally asked, the question Garrett had been avoiding. "Didn't you like us anymore?" Abigail set down her spoon, her composure faltering for the first time. "Oh, Tommy, no, I had. Business I needed to attend to back east, family matters." "But you're our family too," Tommy insisted with the simplicity of childhood logic. Garrett cleared his throat. "Tommy, that's enough questions for now. Finish your supper, then you can get ready for bed." "But Pa, no arguments." Garrett's voice was firm but gentle. "Miss Abigail's had a long journey, she's tired." Tommy reluctantly returned to his meal, though his eyes kept darting between the adults, sensing the undercurrents he couldn't fully understand. After supper, Garrett supervised Tommy's bedtime routine while Abigail insisted on washing the dishes. When he returned from tucking his son in, he found her standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames, her profile gilded by the flickering light. "He's grown so much," she said without turning, "and he's so like you." Garrett leaned against the doorframe. "Children have a way of doing that, growing, changing. 18 months is a long time in a child's life." She turned to face him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's a long time in anyone's life, Garrett. Why are you here, Abigail?" He kept his voice low, mindful of Tommy in the next room. "You made your choice clear enough when you left." She took a deep breath. "I came back because I promised I would, and because—" She faltered, then squared her shoulders. "Because I never stopped loving you or Tommy, not for a single day." Garrett gave a bitter laugh. "Love? Is that what you call it, riding away without so much as a proper goodbye?" Tommy cried himself to sleep for weeks. "I had to tell him you weren't coming back." "I know I hurt you both," she whispered. "If I could have done things differently, but you didn't," he cut in. "You left us, Abigail. You left a 5-year-old boy who had already lost his mother. You left without explanation beyond some vague talk about obligations back east." Her chin lifted slightly. "Those obligations were real, Garrett. My father was dying. He sent for me and I had to go." "Your father," Garrett frowned. "You told me your parents were both dead." "I told you what I needed to at the time," she admitted. "The truth is complicated and I wasn't ready to share it then. And now I'm ready to tell you everything if you're willing to listen." The earnestness in her voice gave him pause. Despite his anger, despite the walls he'd built around his heart, he found himself nodding. "I'm listening." Abigail sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My father was Gregory Zimmerman." Garrett's eyes widened in recognition. "The railroad magnate, that Gregory Zimmerman," she nodded. "I was raised in privilege in Philadelphia, expected to make an advantageous marriage and continue the family legacy. But I wanted more than fancy parties and a husband chosen for his business connections. So you ran west, Garrett surmised, beginning to understand. I took money from my trust fund and disappeared. I wanted to see the country, to live on my own terms. A small smile touched her lips. I never expected to end up teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in a town barely on the map. Or falling in love with a widowed rancher and his son, Garrett added quietly. That was the most unexpected part of all, she agreed, her voice softening, and the most wonderful. Then why leave? If we meant so much to you, my father's lawyers tracked me down, she explained. He was dying of consumption and wanted to reconcile before the end. They made it clear that if I didn't return, he would change his will and disinherit me completely. Garrett's brow furrowed. Since when did money matter so much to you? It wasn't about the money, Abigail said, shaking her head. It was about my mother's legacy, the philanthropic foundations she established before her death. If my father changed his will, those foundations would lose their funding. So you sacrificed us for charity work. Garrett couldn't keep the hurt from his voice. I thought I could have both, she admitted. I planned to settle my father's affairs and return within a few months, but his illness lingered, and then there were legal battles with his business partners. She looked up at him imploringly. I wrote to you, Garrett, dozens of letters. He stared at her. I never received any letters. Abigail's face paled. None of them, but I sent them regularly, first to the ranch, then through the post office in town when I didn't hear back. Garrett's mind raced. The postmaster in Sweetwater Creek changed last year. Old Jim Watkins retired and his nephew took over. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. Jim knew to bring ranch mail out with the supply wagons, but the new fellow might not have bothered. Or perhaps they never arrived at all, Abigail said softly. My father's associates were not above intercepting mail to keep me isolated until everything was settled. They fell silent, each contemplating what this might mean. Why now? Garrett finally asked. Why come back after all this time? My father passed 6 months ago. It took until now to settle his estate and ensure my mother's foundations were secure. She stood, moving closer to him. I came back because this is where I belong, Garrett, with you and Tommy if you'll still have me. The longing in her eyes matched the ache in his own heart, but caution held him back. You can't just walk back into our lives and expect everything to be as it was, Abigail. Too much has happened. I know, she whispered. I'm not asking for things to be as they were. I'm asking for a chance to build something new, something stronger. She reached for his hand hesitantly. I'm asking for forgiveness. Her touch sent electricity through him, awakening feelings he'd tried so hard to bury. But before he could respond, a small voice came from the bedroom doorway. Pa, is Miss Abigail staying with us now? They turned to see Tommy standing there in his nightshirt, his hair tousled from bed. Garrett sighed, releasing Abigail's hand. You should be asleep, son. I heard talking, Tommy explained, then looked hopefully at Abigail. Are you staying? Please say you're staying. Abigail glanced at Garrett, uncertainty in her eyes. That's up to your father, Tommy. Tommy crossed the room to stand before his father, his expression suddenly serious. Pa, remember what I told you when you were sad. Miss Abigail makes you smile like Mama used to. Don't you want to smile again? The simple wisdom of his child struck Garrett to the core. He looked from Tommy to Abigail, seeing in her eyes the same love and hope that had first drawn him to her 2 years ago. We have a lot to talk about, he said carefully, and trust to rebuild. But yes, Miss Abigail can stay for now. He held up a hand as Tommy began to cheer. In the spare room, he added firmly, now back to bed with you. Tommy hugged Abigail tightly before allowing himself to be led back to bed. When Garrett returned, he found Abigail still standing by the fire, tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve his forgiveness, she said quietly, or yours. Garrett took a deep breath. Maybe not yet, but Tommy's right about one thing. I haven't smiled much since you left. He moved to stand beside her, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that had haunted his dreams. I think we owe it to ourselves and to him to see if we can find our way back to each other. I won't leave again, she promised. Whatever happens between us, I'm here to stay. For the first time that evening, Garrett allowed himself a small smile. Then I guess we've got ourselves a starting point. The following morning dawned bright and clear, with the fresh promise that only the western sky could deliver. Garrett had risen early, as was his habit, to tend to the morning chores before Tommy woke. As he stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, he was surprised to find Abigail already outside, watching the sunrise from the rocking chair. "You're up early," he observed, pausing at the door. She turned, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Old habits. In Philadelphia, sunrise was the only time I could find any peace and quiet." Garrett nodded, unsure of what to say next. The awkwardness of the previous night still hung between them, but in the clear light of morning his anger had softened somewhat. "I'm heading to the barn," he said finally. "Need to milk the cow and check on a new foal that came yesterday." Abigail set aside the blanket she'd wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "May I join you? I'd like to make myself useful if I'm staying." Her request surprised him. The Abigail he'd known before had never shied away from ranch work, but he'd half expected the refined Eastern lady who had returned to have lost her taste for such things. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, trying to sound indifferent. They walked to the barn in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. Inside, the familiar smells of hay, leather, and livestock greeted them. Garrett lit a lantern and hung it on a hook before moving to Bessie's stall with the milk bucket. "Hello, girl," he murmured to the Jersey cow, who greeted him with a soft moo. Abigail leaned against the stall door, watching as he positioned the stool and began the rhythmic work of milking. "The place has grown," she observed. "You've added on to the barn." "Had to," Garrett replied, focusing on his task. "Herds nearly doubled since last year. We're up to 60 head now." "That's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You always said 50 head would make the ranch truly viable." He glanced up, surprised that she remembered such a detail. "We've been lucky. Good calving seasons, fair prices at market." "It wasn't luck, Garrett. It was hard work and good management." She hesitated, then added, "I always believed in your vision for this place." The compliment warmed him more than he wanted to admit. "There's still a long way to go," he said gruffly. When he'd finished with Bessie, he showed Abigail the new foal, a spindly-legged colt with a white blaze down his face, standing close to his mother in the far stall. "He's beautiful," Abigail breathed, her face lighting up. "What's his name?" "Tommy hasn't decided yet," Garrett said, allowing himself a small smile. "He takes naming very seriously, says a good name shapes a horse's character." Abigail laughed, the sound echoing in the barn. "He's a wise soul, your boy." "Our boy," Garrett corrected automatically, then froze, realizing what he'd said. Abigail's eyes widened, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. "I mean," Garrett began. "I know what you meant," Abigail said softly. "And it means everything to me that you thought of us that way, even if only for a moment." The honesty in her voice disarmed him. "Tommy loved you from the start," he admitted. "He'd lost his mother so young he barely remembered her. When you came to town and started teaching at the school, you were so patient with him, so kind." He swallowed hard. "I think he started loving you before I did." "And when did you," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "start loving me?" Garrett turned back to the foal, stroking its soft muzzle as he gathered his thoughts. "I fought it at first. Elizabeth had only been gone 2 years. It felt like betrayal." He took a deep breath. "But that day you brought Tommy home after he'd fallen in the creek, you'd waded in after him, ruined your only good dress, and still you were laughing as you carried him home on your back." He smiled at the memory. "You set him down on the porch, dripping wet, and told me very seriously that my son had heroically tried to rescue a frog from drowning, and that such compassion should be rewarded rather than scolded." Abigail's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I remember. You looked so stern, but then you started laughing, and suddenly we were all laughing together." "That's when I knew," Garrett said simply. "That's when I knew I loved you." The weight of the confession hung between them, 18 months of hurt and absence making it both more powerful and more fragile. "I never stopped," Abigail whispered. "Even when I thought you might hate me for leaving, I never stopped loving either of you." Garrett was saved from responding by Tommy's voice calling from the house. "Pa, Miss Abigail, where are you?" "In the barn," Garrett called back, clearing the emotion from his throat. Tommy appeared moments later, his hair sticking up at odd angles, still in his nightshirt with boots hastily pulled on. You weren't in the house, he accused, looking from his father to Abigail. I thought maybe Miss Abigail had gone away again. The naked fear in his son's voice tore at Garrett's heart. Abigail immediately knelt in front of Tommy, taking his small hands in hers. I promised I'd stay, didn't I? She said gently. I keep my promises, Tommy. I'm not going anywhere. Tommy studied her face, his expression far too serious for a 6-year-old. You promised before, too. Garrett winced at his son's directness, but Abigail didn't flinch. You're right, she acknowledged, and I'm so sorry I couldn't keep that promise, but things are different now. I'm here to stay if you and your father will let me. Tommy looked up at his father questioningly. Garrett rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Miss Abigail and I are still figuring things out, he said honestly, but she's welcome to stay as long as she wants. This seemed to satisfy Tommy, whose face brightened. Can we show her the new colt and the chicken coop and the tree house you built me? Garrett couldn't help smiling at his son's enthusiasm. All in good time. First, you need to get dressed properly and have some breakfast. I could make breakfast, Abigail offered tentatively, if that would be all right. Flapjacks? Tommy asked hopefully. Miss Abigail makes the best flapjacks in the territory, Pa. So I've heard, Garrett said dryly, though he couldn't deny the appeal of Abigail's cooking after months of his own utilitarian meals. Flapjacks sound fine. As they walked back to the house, Tommy between them, chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to show Abigail, Garrett caught her eye over his son's head. The warmth in her gaze stirred something in his chest that he'd thought long dead. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to what they'd lost. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and flapjacks as Abigail moved confidently around the space that had once been as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Garrett sat at the table, ostensibly reading yesterday's newspaper from town, but his eyes kept straying to her as she worked. These are even better than I remembered, Tommy declared around a mouthful of flapjacks dripping with maple syrup. Don't talk with your mouth full, Garrett reminded him, but without any real sternness. It was hard to maintain his guard when the scene before him, Tommy beaming, Abigail at the stove, the cabin filled with warmth and good smells, was exactly what he had dreamed of during those long, lonely months. I thought we might ride into town today, Garrett said casually, folding the newspaper. Need to pick up some supplies and… He hesitated, then forged ahead. And folks should know you're back, Abigail. She turned from the stove, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features. Are you sure? People will talk. People always talk, he replied with a shrug. Better they see you with us than hear wild rumors. Can I ride my own pony? Tommy asked eagerly. I've gotten real good, Miss Abigail. Pa says I'm a natural horseman. Abigail smiled, reaching out to smooth his tousled hair. I'm sure you are, sweetheart. I can't wait to see. The ride into Sweetwater Creek took just under an hour. The town had grown somewhat since Abigail had last seen it. A new saloon had opened at the far end of the main street, and the general store sported a fresh coat of paint and expanded porch. As they tied their horses at the hitching post, Garrett noticed the curious glances already being cast their way. Sweetwater Creek might have grown, but it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the schoolteacher who had left suddenly 18 months ago, returning on the arm of the widowed rancher, was guaranteed to set tongues wagging. Chin up, he murmured to Abigail, who had gone slightly pale. You haven't done anything wrong. She gave him a grateful look before composing her features into a serene expression. Tommy, oblivious to the undercurrents, hopped down from his pony and grabbed Abigail's hand. Can we go to the candy store after Pa's done with his boring grown-up business? He asked hopefully. Abigail glanced at Garrett, who nodded his permission. We'll see, she told Tommy, but only if you behave while we're in town. The bell above the general store's door jingled as they entered. Old Sam Fulton looked up from where he was stacking cans on a shelf, his eyes widening at the sight of Abigail. Well, I'll be, he said, adjusting his spectacles as if to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Miss Zimmerman back from the dead. I was never dead, Mr. Fulton, Abigail replied with a small smile, just back east for a time. A long time, the storekeeper observed, his gaze shifting to Garrett with undisguised curiosity. Welcome back all the same, town's been poorer without its schoolteacher. They found a replacement? Abigail asked. Sam snorted. If you can call him that, young fellow from Kansas, more interested in courting the widow Jenkins than teaching the children their letters. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, the school board's been looking for a reason to let him go. Your timing might be providential. Abigail looked startled at the suggestion. I haven't given any thought to resuming teaching, she said carefully. I've only just returned. Garrett, who had been examining a new plow blade, found himself listening intently for her answer. He hadn't considered what Abigail might want to do now that she was back. Would she be content at the ranch, or would she seek to reclaim her independence? Well, think on it, Sam advised. Now, what can I help you folks with today? As Garrett went through his list of supplies, he was aware of Abigail and Tommy wandering around the store, examining the new goods that had arrived on the last freight wagon. Tommy's excited voice carried as he discovered a display of tin soldiers, while Abigail admired a bolt of blue calico fabric. Their shopping completed, they stepped back onto the boardwalk to find several townspeople had gathered, ostensibly going about their business but clearly curious about the returned schoolteacher. Martha Dawson, the midwife who had delivered half the children in the county, was the first to approach directly. Abigail Zimmerman, as I live and breathe, she exclaimed, enfolding the younger woman in a brisk embrace. Where on earth have you been, girl? You gave us all quite a fright, disappearing like that. It's a long story, Mrs. Dawson, Abigail said, returning the hug with genuine warmth. Family matters called me east rather suddenly. And now you're back, Martha observed, her shrewd eyes taking in the way Tommy clung to Abigail's skirts and how close Garrett stood beside her. For good? Abigail glanced at Garrett before answering. Yes, for good. The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, sent an unexpected surge of emotion through Garrett. Despite their unresolved issues, despite the hurt and mistrust still simmering beneath the surface, hearing her commit to staying affected him deeply. Well, that's splendid news, Martha said approvingly. Just splendid. And I imagine the school board will be pleased as punch when they hear. Before Abigail could respond, a commotion at the end of the street drew everyone's attention. A rider was approaching at a dangerous pace, his horse kicking up dust as he thundered down the main street. That's Ben Parker's boy, someone muttered. Riding like the devil himself is at his heels. The young man, no more than 18, reined in his lathered horse directly in front of the group. Mr. Holloway, he gasped, his face streaked with dust and sweat. Pa sent me to find you. There's trouble at your south pasture rustlers hid in the night. Took near 20 head and shot your foreman when he tried to stop them. Garrett's blood ran cold. Will's been shot. How bad? Don't know, sir. Pa was tending to him when I left, said to find you quick as can be. Garrett turned to Abigail, conflict evident in his expression. Tommy had gone pale, clutching tighter to Abigail's skirts. Go, Abigail said immediately, understanding. Tommy and I will be fine. We can wait at the hotel until it's safe. Garrett hesitated only a moment before nodding. Take care of my boy, he said, his voice low. I'll send word when I can. Pa, I want to go with you, Tommy protested, his lower lip trembling. Garrett knelt quickly, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. Not this time, partner. I need you to stay with Miss Abigail and keep her safe. Can you do that for me? Tommy swallowed hard, then nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. Garrett squeezed his son's shoulder, then stood and met Abigail's worried gaze. Keep him close, he instructed. Rustlers don't usually come into town, but these ones sound bold. We'll be careful, she promised. You too, Garrett, please. The genuine concern in her voice steadied him. He nodded once, then strode to his horse, swinging up into the saddle with practiced ease. I'll need volunteers, he called to the gathering crowd. Any man who can ride and shoot. Several men stepped forward immediately, including the blacksmith and 2 ranchers who had property adjacent to the Double H. Within minutes, a posse of 8 armed men had assembled, ready to follow Garrett back to his ranch. As they prepared to ride out, Garrett's gaze sought out Abigail and Tommy one last time. The sight of them standing together on the boardwalk, Tommy's small hand clasped in Abigail's, struck him with painful clarity. They were his family, all he had in the world. And now he had to ride away from them toward danger. "God keep you safe," Abigail called as they mounted up. Garrett touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned his horse and led the posse out of town at a gallop, dust billowing in their wake. Martha Dawson placed a comforting hand on Abigail's shoulder as they watched the men disappear. "Come along, dear. You and the boy can wait at my place. It's more comfortable than the hotel, and I reckon we have plenty to talk about. Will Pa be okay?" Tommy asked in a small voice as they walked toward the midwife's house at the edge of town. "Your father is the strongest, smartest man I know," Abigail assured him, though her own heart was racing with fear. "He'll be just fine." Martha's cozy home offered welcome respite from the curious stares of the townspeople. While Tommy was distracted with a set of wooden blocks that Martha kept for visiting children, the older woman sat Abigail down at the kitchen table and poured them both a cup of strong tea. "Now then," Martha said, settling across from her with an expression that brooked no evasion, "let's hear the real story of why you left and why you've come back." Abigail cradled the warm cup between her palms, finding comfort in its solidity. "It's complicated, Martha." "Life usually is," the midwife replied dryly. "But that man has been walking around with half his soul missing since you disappeared, and that boy has waited by the window every evening for months, hoping to see you coming up the road. They deserve the truth, and so do the rest of us who care about all three of you." Under Martha's steady gaze, Abigail found herself recounting the full story: her privileged background, her father's illness, the coercion that had taken her back east, and the battles she had fought to return as quickly as possible. When she finished, Martha sat back in her chair, considering. "That explains a good deal," she said finally, "though I can't help but think a letter might have spared everyone some heartache." "I wrote dozens," Abigail said, frustration creeping into her voice. "None of them apparently reached Garrett." Martha's eyes narrowed. "That seems mighty convenient for someone who might not have wanted you returning west." "My thoughts exactly," Abigail agreed. "My father's business partners stood to gain considerable control over his assets if I remained isolated and under their influence. And now I've settled my affairs and secured my independence," Abigail said with quiet determination. "I came back as soon as I possibly could." Martha studied her over the rim of her teacup. "And what are your intentions toward Garrett and Tommy?" "They've built a life without you these past 18 months. Hard as it was for them, they've managed." The question stung, but Abigail recognized its legitimacy. "I love them," she said simply. "Both of them with all my heart. I want to be part of their lives in whatever way Garrett will allow." "And if he can't forgive the hurt," Abigail's throat tightened, "then I'll still stay in Sweetwater Creek. I'll find a way to be near them, to prove over time that I can be trusted. I won't abandon Tommy again, even if Garrett and I can never recapture what we had." Martha's severe expression softened. "That's the kind of answer I was hoping for." She reached across the table to pat Abigail's hand. "For what it's worth, I believe you, and I think, given time, Garrett will too." "I hope so," Abigail whispered, glancing over at Tommy, who was constructing an elaborate fort with the wooden blocks. "For all our sakes." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. As afternoon stretched into evening, Tommy grew increasingly anxious, asking repeatedly when his father would return. Abigail did her best to distract him with stories and games, but her own worry made it difficult to maintain a cheerful facade. Martha had just served them a simple supper of stew and biscuits when the sound of hoofbeats outside brought them all to attention. Tommy leapt from his chair and ran to the window. "It's Pa," he cried, his voice breaking with relief. Abigail hurried to join him, her heart in her throat. Through the gathering dusk, she could make out Garrett dismounting wearily from his horse. Even in the dim light, she could see dark stains on his shirt that looked ominously like blood. She and Tommy reached the door at the same time, pulling it open just as Garrett climbed the porch steps. His face was haggard, streaked with dust and what might have been tears, but his eyes lit with relief at the sight of them. "Pa," Tommy launched himself into his father's arms. Garrett caught him, wincing slightly but holding him tight. "Easy there, partner," he murmured into his son's hair. "I'm a bit banged up. Are you hurt?" Abigail asked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. The blood, not mine, Garrett assured her, setting Tommy down gently. Mostly Will's, some from one of the rustlers. Will, is he? Abigail couldn't bring herself to finish the question. He'll live, Garrett said grimly. Took a bullet in the shoulder, but Doc Sanders was at the Parker place for a birthing. Got to Will in time to dig the bullet out. He rubbed a hand over his face. We tracked the rustlers to Serpent Canyon. There were 5 of them. They didn't expect us to catch up so quick, did you? Again, Abigail left the question unfinished. Garrett met her eyes steadily. 2 dead, 2 wounded, and in custody. The 5th got away. His voice hardened. Sheriff's taking the prisoners to the county jail tomorrow. They'll stand trial for rustling and attempted murder. And our cattle, Martha asked practically. Recovered most of them, Garrett said. Lost 3 over a cliff in the confusion, but the rest are back where they belong. Tommy tugged at his father's hand. Can we go home now, Pa? I'm tired. Garrett looked down at his son with a tender expression that contrasted sharply with the hardness that had been in his eyes moments before. Yes, son, we can go home now. He glanced at Abigail. All of us. Martha, ever practical, insisted on feeding Garrett before they left and packed them food for the journey home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Tommy dozing in the saddle in front of his father, Abigail following on her mare. The cabin was dark and cold when they arrived. Garrett carried Tommy inside and put him to bed while Abigail lit lamps and stoked the fire in the hearth. When Garrett emerged from Tommy's room, he looked utterly exhausted. Sit, Abigail instructed gently, guiding him to a chair by the fire. Let me help you. Too tired to argue, Garrett slumped into the chair, watching through half-lidded eyes as Abigail filled a basin with water and gathered clean cloths. She knelt before him and began to carefully clean the blood and grime from his hands and face. You could have been killed, she said softly, her hands gentle as they worked. Occupational hazard, he replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Don't joke about it, Abigail said sharply, then immediately regretted her tone. I'm sorry, I just... The thought of losing you, of Tommy losing you. I know, Garrett said, his voice softening. I thought about that too, riding into that canyon, about what would happen to Tommy if I didn't come back. He caught her hand as she reached to wipe a smear of dirt from his brow. It used to be my greatest fear leaving him alone in the world, but today, for the first time in 18 months, I knew he wouldn't be alone, he'd have you. The simple declaration struck Abigail to the heart. Always, she whispered fiercely. As long as I live, he'll have me. Garrett's eyes, weary as they were, searched hers intently. And me, will I have you too, Abigail? The question hung between them, weighted with all the pain and longing of their separation. Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. If you want me, she answered. I'm yours, Garrett. I always have been, from the moment you laughed with me on that porch, soaking wet from rescuing your son and his frog. For a long moment he said nothing, simply holding her gaze. Then, with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he released her hand and touched her cheek. I tried to hate you, he admitted quietly. Tried to forget you, couldn't do either. I'm so sorry, she whispered, leaning into his touch, for leaving, for not finding a way to let you know why. I understand why now, he said, and maybe in time I can fully forgive. But today seeing you with Tommy, knowing you'd keep him safe if anything happened to me that matters more than old hurts. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. We've lost too much time already. With exquisite tenderness, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, healing a beginning rather than an ending. When he pulled back, the weariness in his face had been replaced by something like hope. We should get some rest, he said, his voice husky. It's been a long day. Abigail nodded, reluctantly moving away from his touch. I'll see you in the morning then. As she stood to go, Garrett caught her hand once more. Abigail, will you be here when I wake up? The vulnerability in his question made her heart ache. Yes, she promised. I'll be here, always. For the first time since her return, a genuine smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and warmed them from within. Good, he said simply. That's good. The next few weeks passed in a gentle rhythm of rediscovery. Garrett and Abigail circled each other carefully, relearning the contours of a relationship that had changed during their time apart. Tommy, however, had no such reservations. He blossomed under Abigail's attention, as if a missing piece of his world had finally slotted back into place. Spring had arrived in earnest, painting the hills surrounding the Double H with wildflowers and fresh grass. The cattle grew fat on the abundant forage, and the mood at the ranch lightened with each passing day. Will, the foreman, was recovering from his wound, though he would carry the scar as a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. One clear morning, Garrett found Abigail in the kitchen garden behind the house, planting rows of vegetables with Tommy as her eager assistant. The sight of them working together, heads bent close in conversation, dirt smudging their clothes, filled him with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. "Careful with those carrot seeds," he called as he approached. "Tommy tends to plant things upside down. I do not." Tommy protested, though he quickly checked the seeds in his hand with a worried expression that made both adults laugh. "You're doing just fine," Abigail assured him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead and leaving a streak of dirt in its wake. "Your father is teasing." "Pa likes to tease when he's happy," Tommy informed her solemnly. "He didn't tease much when you were gone." The innocent observation created a moment of poignant silence. Garrett cleared his throat. "I came to tell you both that I need to ride into town this afternoon. Got a telegram from the sheriff. The trial for those rustlers starts next week, and he needs my testimony." "Can I come?" Tommy asked eagerly. "I want to see if the candy store got those peppermint sticks I like." Garrett exchanged a glance with Abigail before nodding. "I suppose we could all go." "Make a day of it." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else I need to do in town as well." "Oh." Abigail looked up from her planting, curiosity in her eyes. "Need to speak with Reverend Matthews," Garrett said, suddenly finding great interest in adjusting his hat. "About church matters." Tommy wrinkled his nose. "Church is boring, Pa." "Sometimes important things aren't exciting, son," Garrett replied, his eyes still on Abigail, who had gone very still, "but they're worth doing all the same." Understanding dawned in Abigail's expression, followed by a blush that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "I see," she said softly. "Church matters." "Nothing's decided," Garrett added quickly, "just exploring possibilities." The smile that bloomed across Abigail's face was answer enough. "Exploring sounds perfect," she agreed. "I've always been fond of exploration." Tommy looked between them, puzzled by the sudden undercurrent in the conversation. "Are we going to explore the church?" "The bell tower's the best part, but Reverend Matthews doesn't let kids climb up there alone." Garrett laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Not exactly, partner, but if you finish helping Miss Abigail with the garden and get cleaned up, we'll head to town after lunch." The ride to Sweetwater Creek was pleasant, the spring air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the song of meadowlarks. Tommy rode his pony between Garrett and Abigail, keeping up a steady stream of observations about everything they passed. The town was bustling when they arrived, wagons lined up outside the general store and the usual crowd of men lounging in front of the saloon. A few new buildings had sprung up since Abigail's departure, including a proper hotel to replace the old boarding house. "I'll take Tommy to the candy store while you see to your business," Abigail offered as they tied their horses at the hitching rail. Garrett nodded, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "Meet you at the hotel restaurant in an hour. Thought we might have dinner before heading back." "That sounds lovely," Abigail agreed, taking Tommy's hand. As they parted ways, Garrett squared his shoulders and headed toward the small white church at the end of the main street. Reverend Matthews was in his garden, tending to a row of roses with meticulous care. "Afternoon, Reverend," Garrett called, removing his hat as he approached. The older man straightened, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Garrett Holloway, as I live and breathe. Don't often see you in town unless it's Sunday." He wiped his hands on his apron and extended one to shake. "What brings you to my doorstep? Need some advice," Garrett admitted, accepting the handshake. "And maybe a bit of help with a delicate matter." The Reverend's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Would this have anything to do with the return of a certain schoolteacher who was spotted riding into town with you today?" News traveled fast in Sweetwater Creek. Garrett cleared his throat. "It might," he acknowledged. "Things between us are complicated." Love often is, the Reverend said sagely. Come inside, my friend. I find matters of the heart are best discussed over coffee. Inside the small parsonage, Reverend Matthews brewed strong coffee while Garrett explained the situation: Abigail's sudden departure, her recent return, and the slow process of rebuilding trust between them. And now you're thinking of marriage, the Reverend surmised, sliding a steaming cup across the table. Garrett took a sip, gathering his thoughts. I'm thinking I don't want to lose her again, he said finally. I'm thinking Tommy needs her hell. I need her, and life's too short and too uncertain to waste more time being cautious. Have you forgiven her? The blunt question caught Garrett off guard. I'm trying to, he admitted. Most days I think I have. But then something will remind me of how it felt when she disappeared, and I wonder if I can really trust that she'll stay. Reverend Matthews nodded thoughtfully. Marriage isn't just about love, Garrett. It's about forgiveness daily, hourly sometimes. It's about choosing to trust even when your heart is scarred from previous wounds. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I married you and Elizabeth, God rest her soul. I saw how you loved her, how you grieved when she was taken. Are you certain your heart is truly ready to commit again? That's just it, Garrett said slowly. With Elizabeth, it was different. We were young, starting out together. What I feel for Abigail, it's deeper somehow, forged through loss and separation. He met the Reverend's gaze steadily. I know what it means to lose someone now. And I know I don't want to waste whatever time we have left being afraid to trust again. Reverend Matthews smiled, satisfaction evident in his expression. That's the answer of a man who has done his soul searching, he said approvingly. So, when would you like to hold this wedding? Garrett's eyes widened. I haven't actually asked her yet, Reverend, the older man chuckled. Well, that would be the traditional first step, wouldn't it? Though if the way she looks at you is any indication, I don't think you need worry about her answer. And if she says yes. When could you perform the ceremony? For you and that fine woman, any day you choose. The Reverend's expression turned thoughtful. Though if I may offer a suggestion, the spring festival is next Saturday. The whole town will be gathered, the church will be decorated with flowers, and it would give everyone a chance to celebrate your happiness. Garrett considered the idea. That's only 10 days away. Too soon, a slow smile spread across Garrett's face. Not soon enough. Meanwhile, Abigail and Tommy had made their purchases at the candy store and were wandering along the boardwalk, enjoying the spring sunshine. Tommy proudly carried his paper bag of peppermint sticks, occasionally pulling one out to admire before tucking it safely away again. Miss Abigail. He asked suddenly, looking up at her with serious eyes. Are you going to marry my pa? Abigail nearly stumbled at the unexpected question. What makes you ask that, Tommy? He shrugged with the casual honesty of childhood. Mrs. Dawson told Mrs. Parker that you and pa were dancing around the inevitable and should get on with it before someone else catches his eye. What does that mean? Abigail bit back a laugh at hearing Martha's forthright opinions repeated in Tommy's innocent voice. It means, she said carefully, that Mrs. Dawson thinks your father and I are very fond of each other. You love him, don't you? Tommy persisted. And he loves you. Pa told me once that when people love each other, they get married. It's a bit more complicated than that, Abigail hedged, though her heart warmed at the thought that Garrett might have discussed love with his son. Your father and I have been apart for a long time. We're still getting to know each other again. Tommy considered this, his brow furrowed in concentration. But if Pa asked you, would you say yes? Abigail stopped walking and knelt to Tommy's level, meeting his earnest gaze. That's a very direct question, young man. Pa says being direct saves time, Tommy replied. Your father is a wise man, Abigail said with a smile. So I'll be direct too. Yes, Tommy, if your father asked me to marry him, I would say yes. But that's a decision he needs to make on his own without any pressure from us. Do you understand? Tommy nodded solemnly, then broke into a wide grin. Good, because I asked him to marry you last week and he said he was thinking about it. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. You did what? I told him he should marry you so you'll stay forever, Tommy explained matter-of-factly. He said it wasn't that simple, but then he smiled like he does when he's figuring out a solution to a problem. He looked at her hopefully. So maybe he'll ask soon. Abigail felt a blush creeping up her cheeks. Perhaps, she managed, straightening up and taking Tommy's hand again. But that's our secret for now, all right. We'll let your father do things in his own time. All right, Tommy agreed easily. Can we go see if the hotel has pie? I'm hungry. Grateful for the change of subject, Abigail led him toward the hotel restaurant, her mind whirling with the implications of Tommy's revelation. Garrett was thinking about marriage. The thought sent a thrill of anticipation through her. After all they had been through, could they really find their way to such happiness? The hotel restaurant was nearly empty when they arrived, being between the lunch and dinner crowds. They claimed a table near the window, and Abigail ordered coffee for herself and milk for Tommy, along with 2 slices of apple pie. "Do you think Pa will be much longer?" Tommy asked, swinging his feet under the table as he sipped his milk. "I'm not sure, sweetheart. He had several errands to run." Abigail glanced out the window, wondering where Garrett was and what church matters he might be discussing with Reverend Matthews. As if summoned by her thoughts, Garrett appeared in the doorway of the restaurant. His eyes found them immediately, and the smile that spread across his face as he approached their table made Abigail's heart flutter. "Enjoying yourselves?" he asked, pulling out a chair and joining them. "We got peppermint sticks," Tommy announced, patting the pocket where he'd stashed his treasures. "And pie, I can see that," Garrett said, reaching over to wipe a smudge of apple filling from his son's chin. "Save room for dinner, though. We've got a special night planned." "We do?" Abigail asked, surprised. Garrett nodded, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. "Thought we might take advantage of being in town. The hotel's dining room serves a proper dinner at 6 tablecloths, multiple courses, the works." "That sounds lovely," Abigail said, wondering at the sudden formality. "But I'm hardly dressed for fine dining." She gestured to her simple day dress, serviceable for ranch life but not elegant by any means. "You look beautiful," Garrett said simply, his eyes warm as they met hers. "But if you're concerned, Martha mentioned she has some things you might borrow. I took the liberty of arranging for her to meet you upstairs in an hour." Abigail raised her eyebrows. "You've been busy with your errands." "Very busy," Garrett agreed, a hint of nervousness beneath his casual tone. "Tommy and I have some preparations of our own to make, don't we, son?" Tommy nodded eagerly, though he looked slightly confused. "We do, indeed we do," Garrett said, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "Man-to-man business." Intrigued and slightly bemused, Abigail allowed herself to be escorted upstairs after finishing her pie, where Martha Dawson was waiting with a knowing smile and a beautiful blue dress laid out on the bed. "Garrett Holloway asked for my help," Martha explained as she closed the door behind them. "Said he wanted tonight to be special for you. Did he tell you why?" Abigail asked, running her fingers over the fine fabric of the dress. It was simpler than the fashionable gowns she'd worn in Philadelphia, but far more elegant than anything she'd worn since coming west. Martha's eyes twinkled. "He might have mentioned something about important questions and new beginnings, but I wouldn't want to spoil any surprises." Abigail's heart began to race. Could it be that Garrett was planning to propose tonight? After their conversation at the ranch that morning and Tommy's revelation earlier, it seemed suddenly possible. "Now, let's get you ready," Martha said briskly, helping Abigail out of her day dress. "A man doesn't go to this much trouble every day, and I, for one, am eager to see Garrett Holloway finally claim his happiness." An hour later, Abigail descended the hotel stairs, her heart pounding with anticipation. The blue dress fit perfectly, its simple lines complementing her figure without ostentation. Martha had arranged her hair in an elegant style, with a few golden tendrils framing her face. Garrett was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, a clean black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his usually unruly hair slicked back neatly. But it was the look in his eyes as he watched her approach that took Abigail's breath away, a mixture of wonder, desire, and something deeper that made her feel truly cherished. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said softly when she reached him. "And you are very handsome," she replied, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from his lapel. "Where's Tommy?" with Martha, Garrett explained. She offered to take him for ice cream and then bring him back later. I thought we might enjoy some time alone. He offered her his arm, and Abigail took it, feeling a delightful flutter of nerves as he led her into the dining room. The space had been transformed since their earlier visit. White tablecloths covered the tables, oil lamps cast a warm glow, and a small vase of wildflowers sat in the center of each setting. To Abigail's surprise, the dining room was empty save for one table in the center, set for two with the hotel's finest china and silverware. "Did you arrange this?" she asked, astonished. Garrett's smile was both shy and pleased. "Might have asked for a little privacy. The owner owed me a favor after I helped rebuild his barn last fall." He pulled out her chair, and Abigail sat, marveling at the thoughtfulness of his arrangements. As Garrett took his seat across from her, the hotel owner himself appeared with a bottle of wine. "Evening, Mr. Holloway, Miss Zimmerman," he said, pouring 2 glasses with a flourish. "Chef's preparing something special for you folks tonight. Anything else you need, you just say the word." "Thank you, Henry," Garrett said warmly. "This is perfect." As the owner retreated, Garrett raised his glass. "To second chances," he said quietly, "and to having the courage to take them." Abigail touched her glass to his, her heart full. "To second chances," she echoed. The meal that followed was the finest Abigail had eaten since leaving Philadelphia. Tender roast beef, fresh spring vegetables, and a delicate apple tart for dessert. But more than the food, she savored the conversation. Garrett spoke of his hopes for the ranch, of Tommy's future, of the life he envisioned in the years to come. And with each shared thought, each dream described, Abigail felt herself being woven into the fabric of that future. There was no explicit mention of marriage, but the implication was clear in every word, every glance exchanged across the candle-lit table. As they lingered over the last of the wine, Garrett reached across the table to take her hand. "I've been thinking a lot these past weeks," he began, his voice dropping to an intimate tone. "About what I want, what Tommy needs, what would make us truly happy." Abigail's pulse quickened. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That life is too short for caution," he said simply. "That love, when it's real, deserves to be embraced without reservation." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I almost lost everything once when Elizabeth died. Then I found you, and for the first time I believed in second chances." He took a deep breath. "When you left, I thought I'd been a fool to hope, but now you're back, and I find myself hoping again, not just for a while, but forever." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. Garrett, before she could continue, the dining room door burst open and Tommy came racing in, followed by an apologetic-looking Martha. "Pa," Tommy exclaimed, skidding to a halt beside their table. "Did you ask her yet? Mrs. Dawson said I should wait, but I couldn't anymore." Garrett closed his eyes briefly, a mix of exasperation and fondness crossing his features. "No, son, I was just getting to that part." "Oh," Tommy's face fell. "Sorry, Pa," Martha hurried forward. "I'm so sorry, Garrett. He got away from me while I was paying for the ice cream." "It's all right," Garrett said, rising from his chair. He looked at Abigail with a rueful smile. "Not exactly how I planned this, but perhaps it's fitting that Tommy be part of it." He extended his hand to her. "Will you walk with me, both of you curious?" Abigail placed her hand in his and stood. Together, the three of them walked out of the hotel and down the main street of Sweetwater Creek, now quiet in the gathering dusk. Martha followed at a discreet distance, a smile playing on her lips. Garrett led them to the small town square where a gazebo stood surrounded by newly blooming flowers. Lanterns had been hung from its rafters, casting a gentle glow in the twilight. "Tommy, remember what we talked about earlier?" Garrett asked, kneeling to his son's level. "About the question I wanted to ask Miss Abigail." Tommy nodded solemnly, reaching into his pocket and producing a small velvet box with the careful reverence of a child entrusted with a great responsibility. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as Garrett took the box from his son, then turned to her and slowly knelt on one knee. "This isn't how I imagined doing this," he admitted, looking up at her with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I had a whole speech planned about new beginnings and building a life together, but maybe the simplest words are best." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. I love you, Abigail Zimmerman. I think I've loved you since that day you brought Tommy home soaking wet and made me laugh again after years of grief. I want to build a life with you not just for Tommy's sake, but for my own and for yours. Will you marry me? Tears spilled freely down Abigail's cheeks as she looked at the man before her, strong yet vulnerable, scarred by life yet still capable of such love. She glanced at Tommy, who was watching with wide, hopeful eyes, and at the small ring that represented so much more than just a promise of marriage. It was a symbol of healing, of second chances, of a future brighter than either of them had dared to hope for. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly. Yes, Garrett Holloway, I will marry you. Tommy let out a whoop of joy as Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that spoke of years of longing and the promise of many more to come. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, they found themselves surrounded by a small crowd of townspeople who had gathered at the commotion. Martha stood at the front, beaming with satisfaction, while Reverend Matthews had appeared from somewhere and was nodding approvingly. Well, the Reverend called. Shall we announce a wedding date, or are you two going to keep us in suspense? Garrett looked at Abigail questioningly. The spring festival is next Saturday, he said. Reverend Matthews suggested it might be a fine day for a wedding, with the whole town already gathered to celebrate. Next Saturday, Abigail repeated, surprised by the nearness of the date. Too soon. Garrett asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his expression. We can wait if you'd prefer. No, Abigail interrupted, her heart sure. Next Saturday is perfect. I've waited long enough to be your wife. The crowd erupted in cheers and well wishes, and suddenly they were surrounded by friends and neighbors offering congratulations. Tommy wiggled his way between them, and Garrett lifted him up so that the three of them were embracing as a family, the family they were meant to be. Are you happy, Pa? Tommy asked, his small arms wrapped around his father's neck. Garrett looked from his son to his fiancée, his eyes bright with emotion. Happier than I ever thought possible, son. I told you she makes you smile like Mama used to, Tommy said with the satisfied air of a child proven right. That she does, Garrett agreed, pressing a kiss to Abigail's temple. That she does. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Word spread quickly throughout the county, and friends from neighboring ranches sent gifts and offers of help. The women of Sweetwater Creek rallied around Abigail, determined that their returned schoolteacher would have a wedding to remember despite the short notice. Martha Dawson took charge of the wedding dress, enlisting several skilled seamstresses to adapt a gown that had once belonged to her niece. Abigail, accustomed to the finest couture in Philadelphia, found herself moved to tears by the simple beauty of the dress and the love that went into its creation. At the Double H, Garrett and Tommy worked feverishly to prepare the ranch for Abigail's permanent residence. The spare room was transformed into a proper lady's bedroom, with a dressing table salvaged from town and curtains sewn by Martha herself. After the wedding, it would become a sitting room, while Garrett and Abigail would share the master bedroom, a prospect that brought a flush to Garrett's cheeks whenever he considered it. The night before the wedding, as Abigail packed the last of her belongings from Martha's spare room where she'd been staying for propriety's sake, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Tommy standing there in his nightshirt, a serious expression on his small face. "Tommy," she exclaimed. "What are you doing here so late? Does your father know where you are?" "Pa's talking to Reverend Matthews at the church," Tommy explained. "Will brought me to town. He's waiting outside." The ranch foreman had recovered enough from his gunshot wound to resume light duties, including apparently chaperoning nocturnal visits from his employer's son. Abigail ushered Tommy inside. "Is everything all right? You should be in bed, young man." "I needed to ask you something," Tommy said, climbing onto the edge of the bed and swinging his feet nervously. "Something important." Intrigued, Abigail sat beside him. "What is it, sweetheart?" Tommy looked down at his hands, then up at her with solemn eyes. "When you marry Pa tomorrow, will you be my mother? For real, I mean." The question caught Abigail by surprise. "Oh, Tommy," she said softly, "I would be honored to be your mother, but I know you had a real mother who loved you very much, even if you don't remember her well." I know, Tommy said. Pa tells me stories about her sometimes, but he hesitated, then continued with the direct honesty that only children possess. But she's in heaven and I need a mother here, someone to tuck me in and kiss my scrapes and teach me things, like you do. Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes. I would love to be that person for you, Tommy. I will never try to replace your birth mother in your heart, but I promise to love you just as fiercely as she would have. Tommy's face brightened. So I can call you Ma instead of Miss Abigail. If that's what you'd like, Abigail agreed, her heart full. Good. Tommy nodded decisively. Because that's what I already told the kids at school I'd be calling you after the wedding. He hopped down from the bed, apparently satisfied with the conversation. I better get back before Pa notices I'm gone. Will said we had to be quick. Abigail laughed, rising to escort him to the door. Yes, let's not get Will in trouble. Your father needs all his hands healthy for the spring roundup. At the door, Tommy surprised her by throwing his arms around her waist in a fierce hug. I'm glad you came back, he whispered against her skirt. Real glad. Abigail knelt and returned his embrace, breathing in the scent of soap and little boy that had become so precious to her. So am I, Tommy. More than you can possibly know. After seeing him safely off with Will, Abigail returned to her packing with a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow she would become not just a wife, but a mother as well, officially taking on the role she had begun to fill from the moment she'd first met the solemn little boy with sad eyes who had stolen her heart alongside his father. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. The spring festival was already underway when Abigail awoke, the sounds of music and laughter floating through her open window. Martha arrived early to help her prepare, bringing with her a bouquet of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, she recited, laying out each item. The dress is borrowed, the ribbon is blue, the flowers are new and for old. She produced a delicate lace handkerchief. This was my mother's. I thought you might carry it today. Oh, Martha, Abigail breathed, touching the fragile lace reverently. I would be honored. As Martha helped her dress, Abigail found herself surprisingly calm. There were no last-minute jitters, no doubts about the step she was taking. After everything she and Garrett had been through, the separation and the reunion, the hurts and the healing, this moment felt like the natural conclusion to one chapter and the beginning of another, more beautiful one. There, Martha said at last, stepping back to admire her work. You are a vision, my dear. Garrett Holloway won't know what hit him. Abigail turned to the mirror and hardly recognized herself. The dress was simple but elegant, its clean lines and delicate embroidery perfectly suited to a spring wedding in a western town. Her golden hair had been arranged in a loose chignon with a crown of wildflowers nestled among the curls. She looked not like the society girl from Philadelphia, nor exactly like the schoolteacher of Sweetwater Creek, but like someone knew a woman who had found her true self through love and loss and love again. It's time, Martha said gently, breaking into her thoughts. Are you ready? Abigail took a deep breath and nodded. More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life. The church was filled to capacity when they arrived, with latecomers standing at the back and peering through the windows. The spring festival had drawn visitors from neighboring towns as well, and it seemed everyone had turned out to witness the marriage of the widowed rancher and the schoolteacher who had returned from the east. As Abigail waited in the small antechamber, the door cracked open and Tommy slipped in, resplendent in a new suit that was slightly too big for him. Pa sent me to check if you're ready, he said importantly. He's getting nervous. Abigail smiled, straightening his collar. Is he? That makes two of us. You look real pretty, Tommy said, his eyes wide, like a princess in one of those storybooks. And you look very handsome, she replied, smoothing his hair. The perfect escort for a bride. Tommy puffed up with pride at his role. In the absence of family to give her away, Abigail had asked Tommy to walk her down the aisle, a request that had filled the boy with solemn joy. You ready? He asked, offering his small arm with a gravity that nearly made Abigail laugh despite her nerves. Ready, she confirmed, placing her hand on his arm. The church doors opened, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. The organist began to play, and all heads turned to watch as Abigail and Tommy began their walk down the aisle. But Abigail had eyes only for Garrett, standing tall and straight at the altar. He wore a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, but it was the expression on his face as he watched her approach that she would remember forever, a mixture of awe, love, and absolute certainty that made her heart swell with answering joy. When they reached the altar, Tommy solemnly placed Abigail's hand in his father's, then stepped to the side to stand as the best man, his chest puffed out with importance. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Reverend Matthews asked, following tradition despite the unconventional arrangement. "I do," Tommy replied clearly. "Her son." A murmur of approval and a few chuckles rippled through the congregation at the boy's bold claim, but Garrett and Abigail exchanged a glance of perfect understanding. In that moment, they became a family in truth, bound not just by the ceremony about to take place, but by the love that had already woven their lives together. The service was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged the traditional vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all of life's joys and sorrows. When Garrett slipped the gold band onto Abigail's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady and sure, as if this moment was the culmination of a journey long ordained. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Matthews proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled broadly at Garrett. "You may kiss your bride." Garrett needed no further invitation. He gathered Abigail into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of all they had overcome and all they had yet to experience together. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, with Tommy's voice rising above the rest in enthusiastic approval. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Abigail caught sight of Tommy bouncing on his toes with excitement. Without hesitation, she reached for him, and Garrett lifted his son to join their embrace. Together, they walked back down the aisle and out into the spring sunshine, not as two individuals trying to find their way, but as a family, whole and complete at last. The spring festival became a wedding celebration, with tables of food set up in the town square and musicians playing lively tunes for dancing. Abigail and Garrett moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like the entire county. "Mrs. Holloway," Garrett murmured in her ear during a quiet moment. "How does it sound?" Abigail smiled up at him, her heart full, "like the name I was always meant to have." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Tommy found his way to their side, his face flushed with excitement and fatigue. "Can we go home now?" he asked, leaning against Abigail's skirts. "I'm tired." Home, the word had never sounded sweeter. Garrett looked to Abigail, a question in his eyes. She nodded, ready to begin their life together properly. They made their farewells, accepting final congratulations and promises to continue the celebrations at church the following day. Martha embraced Abigail tightly. "Be happy, my dear," she whispered. "You both deserve it." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Tommy dozing in front of Garrett on his horse, Abigail riding beside them. As they crested the final hill and the Double H came into view, Garrett reined in his mount. "Welcome home, Mrs. Holloway," he said softly, his voice full of promise. Abigail looked at the ranch spread out below them, the sturdy cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn and corrals, the rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Beyond that, the mountains rose majestically, still capped with snow despite the spring warmth in the valley. It wasn't the grand mansion she'd grown up in, nor the cultured society she'd once thought essential to happiness. It was something far more precious, a home built with love, a place where she truly belonged. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice catching slightly, "for waiting for me to find my way back." "Always," he promised, and in his eyes she could read the depth of his commitment. "Always." Together, they rode down to the ranch, husband, wife, and son, ready to begin the next chapter of their story under the vast Colorado sky. Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the Double H Ranch, turning the grass golden and the creek to a lazy trickle. In the shade of the large oak tree beside the expanded cabin, Abigail Holloway sat in a rocking chair, a ledger open on her lap as she reviewed the ranch accounts. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention, and she looked up to see 3 riders approaching Garrett, now 40, his lean frame still strong and capable. Tommy, 11 and shooting up like a weed, sitting tall on his own horse. And between them, on a gentle pony, 4-year-old Elizabeth, her golden curls flying in the breeze. Abigail set aside her work and rose to meet them, one hand automatically going to her swollen belly where their 3rd child grew steadily. As they dismounted, Elizabeth spotted her and raced across the yard. "Mama, Mama, I rode all the way to the north pasture without help. Pa said I'm a natural." Abigail caught her daughter in a careful embrace. "Did he now?" "Well, your father knows talent when he sees it." Garrett approached more slowly, his face lighting with the smile that was now a familiar sight rather than the rarity it had once been. He bent to kiss her, his hand resting briefly on her stomach. "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," she assured him. "The accounts are looking good this quarter. Your new breeding program is paying off." "Our breeding program," he corrected gently. "This ranch is as much yours as mine, Mrs. Holloway." Tommy joined them, proudly carrying his sister's saddle. At 11, he was the spitting image of his father, with the same serious eyes that could warm to surprising mischief. "Pa let me ride point today," he announced. "Said I did a fine job." "High praise indeed," Abigail said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Your father doesn't give compliments lightly." "Speaking of compliments," Garrett said, "Martha stopped by earlier. Said to tell you the school board is still hoping you'll consider taking the teaching position again after the baby comes." Abigail smiled thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. With Tommy in the upper grades and Elizabeth starting next year, it might be nice to have us all together." She patted her stomach. "And this little one could come along too once they're here." "Whatever you decide," Garrett said, his arm slipping around her waist. "The ranch is doing well enough that you don't have to work if you don't want to." "I know," she replied, "but I miss teaching sometimes. And the new schoolhouse you helped build is so much nicer than the old one." Elizabeth tugged at her mother's skirt. "If you're the teacher, does that mean I have to call you Miss Zimmerman like the other kids used to call you?" Abigail laughed. "No, sweetheart, you can still call me Mama." "Good," Elizabeth said decisively, "because that's who you are." The simple statement, delivered with a child's certainty, warmed Abigail's heart. She looked at her family gathered around her, the husband who had waited for her return, the stepson who had claimed her as his mother, the daughter named for the woman whose memory they honored, and the unborn child who represented their continuing hope for the future. 5 years ago, she had ridden up to this ranch uncertain of her welcome, carrying only the hope that she might somehow reclaim what she had lost. Now she stood firmly at its center, the heart of a home and a family built on love, forgiveness, and the courage to believe in second chances. "Mama, are you crying?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the tears that had gathered in Abigail's eyes. "Happy tears," Abigail assured her, wiping them away with a smile. "Sometimes when your heart is very full, it spills over a little. Like the creek in springtime," Tommy offered sagely. "Exactly like that," Garrett agreed, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple. "Come on, everyone inside. Supper won't cook itself and your mother needs to rest." As the children raced toward the house, Garrett held Abigail back for a moment, his expression growing serious. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "For what? For coming back, for loving Tommy as your own, for giving us Elizabeth and this new little one." His hand cupped her cheek tenderly, "For making me smile again when I thought I'd forgotten how." Abigail leaned into his touch, the years of love between them a tangible force. "Tommy knew," she said softly. "Even back then, he knew I'd make you smile like Elizabeth used to make you smile. Children see the truth so clearly sometimes." "They do at that," Garrett agreed. "He waited by that window every evening for months, you know, said he knew you'd come back to us." "Smartest boy in the territory," Abigail said with a smile. "Just like his father." Garrett laughed and drew her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "I love you, Abigail Holloway. More with each passing day." "And I love you," she whispered back. "Always." Together, they walked toward the house where their children waited, toward the future they had built from the ashes of loss and separation, a future bright with promise and rich with love. For in the end, It wasn't the grand adventures or dramatic reunions that defined their happiness, but the quiet moments of daily life shared with those who mattered most. The Double H Ranch had become more than just a successful cattle operation. It had become a testament to the healing power of love and the enduring strength of family. And as the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Holloway family gathered around their table, bound together by the love that had brought them through storms and sunshine alike, stronger for the journey, grateful for every step that had led them home.